Okay, so I was thinking lately about the differences between maybe abstract or loose style painting versus like super detailed or more photorealistic style. Now, I kind of find that my happy place is somewhere in the middle where I do include like realistic type details, but also have like a painterly or abstract nature to my paintings. And I've heard a few of you say that you need to work on loosening up or being more loose with your work. And it kind of got me to thinking, okay, well, in my opinion, the hardest part is like all of the detail work and being more detail oriented. So if you're already there and you're really focused on the details, I think that that's already a good artistic trait to have. So that got me to thinking like, well, what are some general ideas or some tricks that can help us to stay kind of within the realm of looseness in our paintings? Because to me, it's easier to be loose than it is to be detailed. So it should be a simple adjustment or a few simple adjustments to keep us more loose in our paintings. So let's go ahead and let's take a look at a few tricks that we can use to apply looseness in our work, along with a painting that I did recently. Okay, for this particular painting, I think that there is a very nice balance between that realism or detail and an abstract sort of painterly feel. So the very first thing I want you to keep in mind, this is the number one trick, and this one is probably the most important. It's to have or keep your details within the focal point, and then as you move away from the focal point, the painting can then become more abstract. So for example, in this painting, the majority of my detail is here because the dog's face, his nose, and his eyes are the focal point. But then as it moves away from that focal point, everything else becomes more abstract. So you can see I didn't spend a lot of time down here trying to detail all this fur. Instead, there is more loose brushstrokes and loose aspects representing the rest of the dog's silhouette. Okay, so number one is to keep your details within the focal point or the most important areas of the painting. So let's go ahead and let's take this painting back to the sketch and we can start to build up from there. So the number two aspect or the number two trick that I want you to keep in mind is that it helps us to start a painting from a more abstract base. Well, what do I mean by that? So for example, with this particular painting, I started with this background and this initial fill for the dog's silhouette, this initial gradient. So this is the point of the painting that I started from, and this can also be created very quickly. So it gives us a very quick, abstract, loose base to then begin building our details on top of. So let's just take a quick look at how we might create these first couple of layers. So let's just say we wanted to start with a background color that will be made up of maybe 2 or 3 different colors. So let's get like a dark, and then maybe we'll go light again. And then I'll use a wash brush to blend these colors together. Just very, very quickly, very loose. And that's probably enough for us to work from. And then let's create another layer. And with the selection tool, I'm going to create a rough outline of the dog's silhouette. Make sure I'm on a new layer. Maybe we'll do something like that. And then create or undo my selection and then set that layer to alpha lock so that the edge of the shape stays sharp while we apply an adjustments Gaussian blur to create a gradient. So then I'll turn alpha lock back off and then use that same wash brush to blend in the edges. And maybe I can even go along and just lightly smudge some of those edges so that that color bleeds out into the background just a bit. Okay, so something like this base here that we have is a good starting point to then lay our the rest of our details on top of. So let's switch back to the actual fill and background that I used for the painting, which is here. So now from this point on, I added another layer and focused on like the darker shadows of the fur here. And then the majority of the work is done by this highlights layer here. So there's lots of very bright highlight that fell on top of the dog's nose, top of his head, and the fur and hair around his ears, creating that really nice highlight. Okay, now we could call this painting done at this stage, I think, because we've got a nice range of values. We've got dark darks and all the middle tones all the way to the lightest highlights. And it's a nice overall composition. But we could begin to push it a little bit further and add some more like abstract or loose type qualities. So tip number 3 is to apply different textures and experiment with different blend modes to see what sort of abstract or painterly qualities we can begin to create. Now I've got a layer group here with several different types of textures, and the first one is a noise texture. Now it's very easy to create this type of texture. The way I do it is to create a new layer, and I fill that layer with just kind of a medium gray. And then I go to noise and drag it to maybe 30-40% and the scale to maybe 30 to 40% as well. And I'll apply a very small Gaussian blur, maybe 2%, and then set that layer to overlay. And so what that does, I'm going to take the opacity back just a little bit. And if we zoom in here, what that does is it creates this little bit of like a grain to the painting that you might find in a traditional painting. Maybe it's the grain of the paper, maybe it's just the grain of the medium, whether it's like acrylic or watercolor or something like that. It just gives it just a nice textural quality. This next texture is just a some really grainy, bristly brush strokes. And I'll take this one and set it to either multiply, darken, or possibly overlay. I'm going to go with overlay and just take the opacity back to where it starts to blend in with the existing stroke, something probably right about 30%. And you can see that it just gives a nice like brush stroke, like a realistic type brush stroke texture to the overall painting. Now, this next one is something I've been it's been experimenting with lately, where just I'm taking lots of different paint strokes. I'm creating like canvas panels like this and just filling them with just colorful brush strokes and scrapes and textures, and then bringing them into a painting and just trying different blend modes just to see what kind of just fun and experimental textures that I can create and then apply in the painting. So taking a look at that, this one here looks like that, and we're going to set it to maybe, well, I kind of like darken here, but we would have to take the opacity back some. Multiply is interesting. I also tend to like some of these like saturation, color, Just so you can get some really interesting results. And then of course you can erase portions of it that you don't like. But we'll just try, leave it at saturation. And I'll bump it up here. To maybe 70%. And then I've got one more here that we'll take, maybe we'll just leave this one on overlay. And then we'll take the opacity back down to 30%. So just applying these different textures gives our painting just a different look and feel just by overlaying all of these different textures and changing their blend modes and doing some experimentation. Okay, let's go back to our original painting for just a bit because I want to show you what I would consider to be number 4. And that is to keep a lot of your colors or the majority of your colors in like a middle value range. So for example, if I just start to sample colors, just different colors in the painting, you'll notice that a lot of them fall in a less saturated zone of the color picker, meaning that we are in this area here versus all the way up into the more saturated area. And so the reason I say that and I suggest that is because these are colors that are more realistic. These are colors that are oftentimes more common in nature. So for example, this dog, because of these colors, it looks more realistic. And then if we wanted to push like more of a loose or abstract element here, we could add another layer and we have all this room to say, okay, well, I want to apply something that it really stands out, this really highlighted orangey red color. And when I start to apply that, it's going to give it this more of a loose or abstract look because this is not a common color found in nature. Okay, so we have this room within the painting to have what I would consider this to be like a color experiment. Okay, because if all of our colors were up in this upper, more saturated range, if we had started painting from those colors, we wouldn't have the room to do that. We couldn't say, okay, well now we're going to push the colors more towards abstract, because we would essentially, we'd already be there with all these really high, intense, saturated colors. And so with that in mind, though, that brings us in to number 5, which is to take the time towards the end of a painting to experiment with what I call chaos. So how do we do that? So taking a saturated color and just applying all of these like different sort of like painterly scrapes and textures and brush marks and just all these things that just kind of make a painting feel like it was done very loosely and very fast. So what I did here was I took that really bright sort of pinkish orangish color, which again is more saturated, and I created all of these different like chaotic marks. So I did that in that color, and then in like a real light color, kind of the same color as the highlight, and I also did it with a very dark color that picked out of the shadows. Okay, so now we have all of this like grainy, sort of chaotic marks that make the painting feel, again, like it's a little bit more abstract and a little bit more loose. Okay, so now I'm going to turn the textures back on, and I'm going to turn these off and just show you how I might go about applying some different effects like that, some chaos effects. So if I were to sample a color here, and let's push it all the way very, very saturated. And I'm going to take a brush that's maybe, I like to use this oil brush that is bristle grain, and just throw these different brush effects around the painting. And the way I'm doing this really is just tapping loosely kind of in the direction that I want the grain to go. I'll usually take the eraser with the same brush and knock those effects back just a little bit there, until it all blends in together and feels like a natural part of the painting. And since we're talking about color, another way that I like to experiment kind of with just another way that I sort of consider like color chaos, or just pushing things to see how far I can go, is to do like some color experiments. And the way I do that is I take the painting and I get on a layer above everything else, and I do a three-finger swipe down and choose copy, or I'm sorry, copy all, and then three-finger swipe down again and choose paste. And that creates a flattened layer on top of everything else that's got all the layers combined. So at this point, we can do some experiments with different colors. One way I like to do that is with a color balance adjustment. I'm going to take the midtones and maybe push them more towards blue. That's interesting. Maybe take the shadows more towards blue as well. Towards yellow here is pretty interesting. I like the blue because it's cooling off some of this area up here up top, but it's keeping that nice red, those nice reddish orange, like chaotic brush marks. So that's kind of cool. And let's try a hue saturation adjustment. Maybe we'll take the saturation, we go up with it. It gets kind of crazy. Now, here's another example for like why we might want to keep our initial colors in that middle range, because we can push the saturation up a little bit, and it's not, if we were already overly saturated, we wouldn't be able to do that. So we wouldn't have the range to play with. So I think I'm actually going to take the saturation down just a touch from where I was. Something like that. And then if we adjust the overall, I think I'm going to leave the hue where it is. Let's see about maybe a curves adjustment. That can probably stay about where it is. Let's go ahead and try one more thing. If we duplicate this layer and we try a gradient map, we'll just choose maybe we'll go with this one, or maybe let's get maybe that one and just see what happens if we set this to overlay, then take it way down. And so now we can even start to do some adjustments on that layer. Maybe we want to push the hue. I like that. That's pretty interesting too. I think I'm going to get somewhere right here. Push the saturation around. Actually, I think I'm going to leave it right there. And just doing that little bit of experimentation is very different. I'm going to combine those two together. So here's my original underneath. And here's the result of a little bit more experimentation. Overall, it's a little bit more warm. This one's got some of those like cool blues and greens in there that are nice. And then that one just feels a little bit more warm overall. But the thing is, I like them both, and I came to the end result by experimenting a bit in those final few stages. So I hope that you found these tips to be useful and that you can apply them right away in your next painting. And hey, before you go, remember to push the like button and hit the subscribe and do all the things so that you don't miss any future videos. Also, if you want to dive deeper into more in-depth tutorials and real-time walkthroughs, come and join me on Patreon, because it's like coming into the studio and hanging out together and doing some learning. All right. So thank you so much for watching this one, and I'll see you in the next one.